Millionaire hired a black tutor for his disabled son, and what he saw broke his heart. The sound of shattering glass pierced the silence of the Blackwood mansion. Richard Blackwood froze at his mahogany desk, the quarterly earnings report forgotten as he heard his son's voice, raw and wounded, echo through the hallway. "Get out! I don't need your help! I don't need anyone's help!" Richard rose from his chair, his 6'2" frame tense with apprehension. Through the crack in his office door, he witnessed something that stopped him cold. Marcus Wright, the tutor he'd hired just 3 weeks ago, kneeling beside his son's wheelchair, undeterred by the shards of glass surrounding them both. Textbooks lay scattered across the hardwood floor, and a puddle of water spread slowly from what had once been an expensive crystal glass. "I'm not leaving, Ethan," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. "And I don't think you really want me to." Richard's hand tightened around the doorknob, ready to intervene when he saw something he hadn't witnessed in the 2 years since the accident. His son's expression softening, vulnerability breaking through the anger that had become his shield. "You don't understand," Ethan whispered, his voice catching. "Nobody does." Marcus placed a hand on the wheel of Ethan's chair, not grabbing, not controlling, just connecting. "Then help me understand." In that moment, Richard Blackwood, tech mogul, self-made millionaire, master of the boardroom, felt something inside him crumble. The weight of his son's suffering, the dignity of the young black man he'd initially questioned hiring, and the devastating realization of his own failure crashed down on him at once. He silently backed away from the door, not wanting to intrude on the first real human connection his son had made in years. What Richard didn't know then was that this moment would be just the beginning. The story of Marcus Wright's presence in their lives would unravel secrets, prejudices, and pain that had been buried for generations in the Blackwood family. It would force Richard to confront not only his shortcomings as a father, but also biases he denied existed within himself. And it would all begin with a simple advertisement. Experienced tutor available for challenging students. Specializes in mathematics and science. References available. 8 weeks earlier, Richard Blackwood paced the length of his home office, phone pressed to his ear, trying to maintain his composure. "Ms. Patterson, with all due respect, this is the 3rd tutor who's quit in 2 months. Surely the agency can find someone who's qualified to work with my son." The woman on the other end of the line sighed. "Mr. Blackwood, we've sent you our most experienced educators, your sons. Difficulties aren't just academic. He needs someone who won't quit when things get hard," Richard interrupted. "That's exactly what Ethan needs, someone who sees beyond the wheelchair and the attitude. Perhaps you should consider a specialized facility that can. My son stays with me." The words came out sharper than he intended. Richard paused, pinching the bridge of his nose. The massive window behind his desk framed the rolling Connecticut countryside, 30 acres of pristine land that surrounded the Blackwood estate like a moat, keeping the world at bay. "Just send me the remaining files of anyone you haven't tried yet." After hanging up, Richard sank into his leather chair, exhaustion settling over him like a familiar blanket. At 48, he felt decades older. The photograph on his desk caught his eye, Ethan at 14, standing on a ski slope, grinning beneath a bright blue helmet, poles raised triumphantly. Just 6 months before the accident that shattered his spine and their lives. Now 16, Ethan was slipping away, retreating behind walls of rage and despair that Richard couldn't breach. His grades were plummeting. His friends had stopped calling. The bright, adventurous boy who'd once filled their home with laughter had been replaced by a stranger who seemed determined to push away anyone who tried to help. Richard's phone chimed with an email notification. The agency had sent the remaining candidate files as promised. He scrolled through them quickly, most not impressive enough to consider, until the last one caught his attention. Marcus Wright, 28, PhD candidate in applied mathematics at MIT. Former high school teacher with experience in special education. Stellar recommendations. The photograph showed a young black man with intelligent eyes and a confident smile. Richard hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. He wasn't prejudiced. He'd built his tech company with a diverse workforce, something he prided himself on. But this was different. This was his home, his son. Would Ethan respond well to someone so different from the previous tutors? Richard's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something heavy crashing upstairs, followed by the raised voice of Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. "Ethan, please, your father is working." Making a split-second decision, Richard hit call on Marcus Wright's contact information. He needed someone exceptional, and conventional approaches had failed spectacularly. Maybe different was exactly what they needed. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, measured voice answered. "Hello, this is Marcus Wright." Mr. Wright, this is Richard Blackwood. I'm calling about your tutoring services. I have a challenging situation with my son. I specialize in challenging situations, Mr. Blackwood. There was a quiet confidence in his voice that Richard found reassuring. My son Ethan is 16. He's bright, gifted, actually, but he's struggling academically since his accident. He's in a wheelchair now, and he's resistant to help. I see, Marcus replied, his tone neutral. May I ask what subjects he's having trouble with? All of them. He's failing everything except computer science. Before the accident, he was on track for early admission to MIT. Richard swallowed the knot in his throat. His mother passed away when he was 10. It's just us, and I'm not reaching him. The admission cost him. Richard Blackwood wasn't accustomed to acknowledging failure, especially to strangers. Mr. Blackwood, Marcus said after a thoughtful pause, I'd like to meet Ethan before making any commitments. Sometimes chemistry between student and teacher is more important than credentials. Of course, when are you available? Tomorrow afternoon, around 3? Richard agreed, giving Marcus the address and detailed directions to the estate. After hanging up, he stared at the photo of Marcus again, wondering if he'd made the right choice. The agency had sent a parade of middle-aged white women with impeccable educational backgrounds, and each had failed to connect with Ethan. Something had to change. Richard just hoped he wasn't making things worse. The next day, Richard watched from his office window as a modest blue Honda pulled up the long driveway. Punctuality, a good sign. The young man who emerged from the car was taller than his photograph suggested, with a lean, athletic build. He wore a navy blazer over a white button-down and khaki pants, professional but not stuffy. Richard met him at the door before Mrs. Winters could answer it. Mr. Wright, he extended his hand. Thank you for coming. Please call me Marcus. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. Richard led him through the soaring entryway of the house. He was accustomed to first-time visitors gawking at the sweeping staircase, the crystal chandelier, the original artwork adorning the walls, subtle displays of the wealth he'd accumulated building Blackwood Technologies from a startup in his garage to a Fortune 500 company. Marcus, however, seemed more interested in the family photographs lining the hallway than the obvious signs of affluence. You have a beautiful home, Marcus observed, pausing at a photo of Ethan and Richard sailing. Is this recent? No, Richard said, the word clipped. That was 3 years ago before. Marcus nodded, understanding the unspoken timeline. Where will I be meeting Ethan? The library. It's where the previous tutors worked with him, though not for long, Richard added with a grimace. I should warn you he's not in a good place today. He had physical therapy this morning, which always puts him in a dark mood. Understandable, Marcus said. Therapy forces him to confront his limitations. Richard glanced at Marcus with mild surprise. It was an insightful observation that none of the previous tutors had made. They reached the double doors of the library and Richard hesitated. I should prepare you. Ethan can be harsh. Mr. Blackwood, Marcus said quietly, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I've faced my share of harsh. I can handle a frustrated teenager. Something in his tone made Richard believe him. He knocked once before opening the doors. Ethan sat by the window, his wheelchair angled to catch the afternoon sun while providing a view of the gardens. At 16, he had Richard's strong jawline and his late mother's expressive brown eyes. His dark hair needed a cut, falling over his forehead in a way that deliberately obscured his face. The muscles in his arms had developed significantly since the accident, a necessity when your legs no longer worked. He didn't look up when they entered, his attention fixed on the tablet in his lap. Ethan, Richard said, forcing brightness into his voice, this is Marcus Wright. He's here about the tutoring position. Another one? Ethan's voice dripped with disdain, still not looking up. What's the pool say about how long this one will last? Mrs. Winters had 3 days for the last one. She was off by 2. Richard felt heat rise in his face. Ethan, that's enough. It's all right, Marcus interjected smoothly. Actually, I'm curious about that myself. He moved further into the room, his body language relaxed. What's your prediction, Ethan? That got the boy's attention. He looked up, taking in Marcus with an appraising stare. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps curiosity. You're different than the others. In what way? Marcus asked, settling into a chair opposite Ethan without waiting for an invitation. Ethan's mouth quirked. You're not a middle-aged white lady clutching her pearls and talking to me like I'm 5. Ethan, Richard admonished. But Marcus chuckled. Fair observation, though Miss Patterson at the agency speaks very highly of those middle-aged white ladies. They have impressive credentials. They were patronizing, Ethan muttered, and they couldn't handle the truth. Which is, Marcus leaned forward slightly. Ethan's eyes hardened. That this is a waste of time. I'm not going to college. What's the point? Richard felt the familiar stab of pain at his son's words. Each time Ethan said something like this, it was like losing him all over again. Marcus, however, didn't flinch. "The point," he said evenly, "might not be college at all. The point might be learning for its own sake, or it might be proving something to yourself, not to your father or to me or to anyone else." Ethan stared at him, clearly not expecting this response. "But," Marcus continued, "if you're asking me to justify why you should bother with trigonometry or American literature when you're dealing with much bigger challenges, I can't. That's something you need to decide." A charged silence filled the room. Richard held his breath, waiting for the explosion, the dismissal, the cutting remark that would send another tutor packing. Instead, Ethan said, "You won't last a week." Marcus smiled. "Care to make it interesting?" "What do you mean?" "A wager. If I last more than a week, let's say 2 full weeks of daily sessions, you give the actual tutoring a genuine effort. No sabotage, no half-hearted attempts." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And if you quit before 2 weeks? Then I admit defeat and I'll tell your father that you were right. You don't need a tutor right now." Richard started to protest, but Marcus held up a hand, his eyes still fixed on Ethan. The teenager considered this, suspicion and interest warring on his face. "What's the catch?" "No catch, but during those 2 weeks I expect respect. Not obedience, not fake enthusiasm, just basic respect. The kind you'd give anyone you just met." Ethan's fingers drummed on the arm of his wheelchair, a habit he'd developed since the accident. "Fine," he said finally, "but when you quit, I want it in writing that I was right." "Deal." Marcus extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan shook it. Richard watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Marcus had managed to engage Ethan more in 5 minutes than the previous tutors had in days, but he'd also just promised to potentially undermine Richard's authority if things went south. "When do we start?" Ethan asked, an unmistakable challenge in his voice. "Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, Marcus replied. "I'll need to review your current coursework tonight." "I'll have copies made," Richard said, relief making him eager to accommodate. "Will you stay for dinner? We can discuss the details of the position." "Thank you, but I have a prior commitment this evening," Marcus said. "Perhaps another time." As Richard walked Marcus back to the entrance, he felt compelled to address what had happened in the library. "That bet you made was necessary," Marcus finished for him. "Ethan needs to feel some control over his situation. Right now, he sees these tutoring sessions as something being done to him, not for him. And if you lose the bet," Marcus gave him a measured look. "I don't intend to lose, Mr. Blackwood, but if I did, would it really matter? You've been through 3 tutors already. Another approach might be needed." Richard nodded slowly, processing this. "You seem to understand him already." "I understand the psychology, not necessarily Ethan himself. That will take time." Marcus paused at the door. "One question before I go. What does Ethan love? Not before the accident now. What brings him joy?" The question caught Richard off guard. He searched his mind and found it distressingly blank. What did Ethan love now? His old passions, skiing, hiking, photography, were painful reminders of what he'd lost. His friends had gradually disappeared when Ethan pushed them away. His grades had plummeted when he stopped trying. I'm not sure," Richard admitted, the words painful to voice. Marcus nodded, not judging, simply accepting this information. "That's our starting point then. Everyone loves something. We just need to find what that is for Ethan now." After Marcus left, Richard stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching the modest blue car disappear down the winding driveway. For the first time in months, he felt something close to hope. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dance between Marcus and Ethan. True to his word, Marcus arrived promptly at 4 each afternoon. True to his nature, Ethan tested every boundary, hurled insults, and employed strategic silence, all tactics that had successfully driven away the previous tutors. But Marcus was different. When Ethan refused to speak, Marcus would simply read aloud from whatever text they were supposed to be studying, occasionally stopping to share an insight or ask a question, never demanding a response but always leaving space for one. When Ethan lashed out verbally, Marcus would listen, acknowledge the feeling behind the words, and then calmly redirect. By the 4th day, Ethan had exhausted his most effective weapons and found himself reluctantly participating in actual lessons. By the end of the 1st week, Richard overheard something he hadn't heard in years: Ethan laughing. It happened during a physics lesson. Richard had been passing the library when the sound stopped him in his tracks, a genuine laugh, not the bitter, sarcastic chuckle that had become Ethan's trademark. "That's ridiculous," Ethan was saying, still laughing. "You can't just change the variables like that." "Why not?" Marcus challenged. "Einstein did. He questioned the very framework everyone else took for granted." "Yeah, but he was Einstein. and before he was Einstein, he was just a patent clerk with wild ideas. The point is, the greatest breakthroughs often come from asking what if instead of accepting what is. There was a pause, and then Ethan said something that made Richard's heart constrict. "I used to think like that, before." "You still can," Marcus replied. "Different perspective, same brain." Richard moved away then, not wanting to eavesdrop further, but the exchange left him thoughtful. That night at dinner, which Ethan had started taking in the dining room again instead of his bedroom, Richard noticed a shift in his son's demeanor. The permanent scowl had softened. He wasn't exactly cheerful, but he was present in a way he hadn't been for months. "How are the lessons going?" Richard ventured, trying to sound casual. Ethan shrugged, pushing his food around his plate. "Fine. Marcus seems to think you're making progress. You've been talking about me?" A flash of the old defensiveness. "Of course," Richard said carefully. "He gives me updates after each session. That's his job." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's different than the others." "In what way?" Richard asked, echoing Marcus's question from their first meeting. "He doesn't pity me." Ethan set down his fork. "And he doesn't pretend the accident didn't happen either. He just accepts it like it's a fact, not a tragedy." Richard nodded, treading carefully in this unexpected moment of openness. "Do you like working with him?" Ethan's expression closed slightly. "He won," he said instead of answering directly. "The bet, 2 weeks are almost up and he didn't quit. So you'll hold up your end, give the tutoring a real chance?" "I said I would." Ethan's jaw set in a way that reminded Richard painfully of Anna, his late wife. She'd had the same expression when her mind was made up, determined, slightly defiant. "I'm glad," Richard said simply, not wanting to push his luck. Later that evening, Richard called Marcus to confirm he'd be continuing in the position. They discussed salary and hours, and then Richard asked the question that had been on his mind all day. "What did you do differently? How did you get through to him when everyone else failed?" There was a thoughtful pause on the other end of the line. "I didn't try to fix him," Marcus said finally. "The others saw a broken boy who needed saving. I see a complete person who's adapting to a new reality. There's a difference." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Wasn't that exactly what he'd been doing, trying to fix Ethan, restore him to some version of his former self? The possibility that he'd been approaching this all wrong was both illuminating and deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm, "Ethan needs to find his own way forward. Our job isn't to carry him or push him, it's to walk beside him while he figures it out." "Call me Richard," he said suddenly. "If you're going to be giving me parenting advice along with tutoring my son, we should at least be on a first-name basis." Marcus chuckled. "Fair enough, Richard, and I apologize if I overstepped." "No," Richard said, surprising himself with his sincerity. "I think I needed to hear that." After they hung up, Richard sat in his office for a long time looking at photographs of Ethan through the years. The smiling child on his first bicycle, the serious preteen at his science fair, the confident teenager on the ski slope. And then nothing, a 2-year gap where milestones should have been captured but weren't, because Richard had been too focused on the accident, the recovery, the what was lost to see what remained. It was time to change that, he decided. Time to see his son not as a problem to solve, but as a person finding his way through an unimaginable challenge. And perhaps, in Marcus Wright, they'd found the guide they both needed for that journey. The tutoring sessions settled into a routine over the next few weeks. Marcus expanded beyond academics, incorporating discussions about philosophy, ethics, and current events. He brought in books that weren't on Ethan's curriculum, but that connected to his interests. Science fiction that explored questions of identity and humanity, biographies of scientists who'd overcome significant obstacles, histories of technological revolutions. Richard kept his distance, not wanting to disrupt the fragile rapport that was developing, but he observed the changes in his son with growing amazement. Ethan's grades were improving. He'd started spending time in his old photography darkroom, adapting his techniques to work from his wheelchair. Most significantly, the anger that had been his constant companion seemed to be receding, making space for a cautious engagement with the world. It wasn't until the 5th week that the first real test of their new arrangement arose. Richard was working from home that day, on a video call with his executive team, when he heard raised voices from the direction of the library. He quickly concluded the meeting and made his way down the hall, concern mounting as the voices grew louder. "You don't get it," Ethan was shouting. "You can't possibly understand, so stop pretending you do." "Then help me understand," Marcus replied, his voice controlled but firm. "Explain it to me. What's the point? You're just like everyone else. You see the chair first, the poor broken kid who needs special help." Richard reached the library door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see Ethan's wheelchair facing the window, his back to the door. Marcus stood a few feet away, his posture open, hands at his sides. "Is that what you think?" Marcus asked. "That I pity you, don't you?" Ethan's voice cracked on the question. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then he pulled a chair closer to Ethan and sat down, bringing them to eye level. "When I was 14, he said, my brother was shot and killed walking home from basketball practice. Wrong place, wrong time, a drive-by meant for someone else." He spoke matter-of-factly, without dramatic inflection. "For 2 years after that, people looked at me differently. They whispered. They treated me like I might break. Teachers gave me passing grades I hadn't earned because they felt sorry for me." Ethan had turned his chair slightly, watching Marcus with wary attention. "The worst part wasn't the pity," Marcus continued. "It was how they stopped seeing me. I wasn't Marcus anymore. I was the boy whose brother was killed. My entire identity reduced to the worst thing that ever happened to me." Richard found himself holding his breath, frozen in place, aware he was intruding but unable to move away. "So no, Ethan, I don't pity you. I respect you too much for that. What happened to you is not who you are. It's just something that happened." Ethan was silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry about your brother," he said finally. "Thank you," Marcus nodded. "His name was Devon. He was brilliant, could have done anything. I think about him every day." "Does it ever get easier?" The vulnerability in Ethan's question made Richard's chest ache. "Not easier," Marcus said thoughtfully. "Different. The pain changes shape, and you build your life around it, not despite it." Ethan nodded slowly, processing this. "Everyone wants me to be who I was before, even my dad, though he tries to hide it." Richard flinched at the accuracy of the observation. "They're not ready to meet the new you yet," Marcus said. "That's about them, not you, but they'll catch up if you give them time." "What if I don't know who the new me is?" "That's the adventure." Marcus smiled slightly. "And for what it's worth, from what I've seen these past few weeks, the new Ethan Blackwood is pretty damn impressive." Ethan ducked his head, but not before Richard caught the small smile that crossed his face. Richard backed away silently, returning to his office with a turbulent mix of emotions. The conversation he'd overheard had shaken him profoundly. He'd never considered that his efforts to help Ethan might actually be hindering him, that his inability to accept his son's new reality was forcing Ethan to carry the additional burden of his father's disappointment, along with his own grief. And Marcus, the revelation about his brother put his exceptional emotional intelligence into context. He understood Ethan's struggle not from textbooks or training, but from lived experience. Richard found himself wondering what else he didn't know about the young man who was having such a profound impact on his son. That evening, when Marcus was preparing to leave, Richard invited him to stay for dinner again. This time, Marcus accepted. The three of them ate in the formal dining room, a space that had rarely been used since Anna's death. Richard had always found large family dinners too painful a reminder of what they'd lost. But tonight, with Marcus filling the third chair at the table, the room felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home again. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Marcus asked about Richard's company, showing a genuine interest in the technological innovations Blackwood Tech was known for. Ethan, to Richard's astonishment, volunteered information about his photography projects, explaining how he was using longer remote triggers to compensate for his limited mobility. "Dad used to be my assistant," Ethan said, a hint of the old mischief in his eyes. "He was terrible at it." "I followed directions perfectly," Richard protested with mock indignation. "You were just an exacting taskmaster." "The light changes every second," Ethan explained to Marcus. "If you're slow, you miss the shot. He once had me hike 2 miles up a trail at dawn, carrying all his equipment to catch the sunrise over this particular valley," Richard recalled, smiling at the memory. "Then he decided the angle wasn't right and made me go another half-mile. It was worth it," Ethan insisted. "That photo won the state competition." "It did," Richard agreed, his smile softening. "It was extraordinary." A comfortable silence fell, broken only when Mrs. Winters brought in dessert, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, Ethan's favorite. Richard noted with quiet pleasure that his son ate with actual appetite, something that had been rare since the accident. After dinner, while Ethan excused himself to work on a project in his room, Richard invited Marcus to his study for a drink. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to Marcus, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "I want to apologize," Richard said after taking a sip. "I overheard part of your conversation with Ethan today. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but you're concerned about your son," Marcus finished for him. "I understand. What you said about your brother, I'm sorry for your loss." Marcus nodded, his expression solemn. "Thank you. I think," Richard hesitated, uncomfortable with the vulnerability but pushing through it. I think you understand Ethan in ways I haven't been able to, and I'm grateful for that. You're his father, Marcus said simply. Your relationship is different, more complex. More burdened, Richard admitted, with expectations, with history. With love, Marcus added. Which complicates everything, Richard smiled ruefully. That it does. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, gathering his thoughts. When Anna, Ethan's mother, died, I threw myself into work. It was easier than facing the grief, both his and mine. I told myself I was providing for him, securing his future. He shook his head. The truth is, I was hiding. We all find ways to cope, Marcus said, his tone free of judgment. After the accident, Richard continued, the words coming more freely now, I did the opposite. I was determined to be there for everything, every doctor's appointment, every therapy session. I thought I could fix it somehow, through sheer force of will. He took another sip of his bourbon. But I was still missing the point, wasn't I? Still not seeing him. Marcus considered this. You were doing the best you could with an impossible situation. Not good enough, though. Richard set his glass down. He needed something I wasn't providing. He needed what all of us need, Marcus said, to be seen for who we are, not who others want us to be. Richard nodded slowly, the truth of this settling over him. I'm trying to learn that now, better late than never, I suppose. It's never too late to change the relationship you have with your child, Marcus said. That's the beauty of it, every day is a new opportunity. They talked for another hour, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Marcus's studies at MIT, Richard's early days building his company, shared interests in technology and innovation. By the time Marcus left, Richard felt a connection to the younger man that went beyond his role as Ethan's tutor. For the first time in years, he'd spoken to someone who seemed to truly understand the complicated tangle of grief, guilt, and love that defined his relationship with his son. That night before going to bed, Richard paused outside Ethan's room. The door was ajar and he could see his son at his desk, focused intently on his computer screen. Without thinking too much about it, Richard knocked gently. Ethan looked up, surprise crossing his features. Dad, what's up? Nothing important, Richard said. Just wanted to say good night and... He hesitated, then pressed on. I thought maybe this weekend we could set up some photography equipment in the garden, if you're interested. The spring flowers are starting to bloom. Ethan studied him for a moment as if trying to decipher a hidden message in the offer. Yeah, he said finally. That would be good, thanks. Great, Richard smiled, resisting the urge to make a bigger deal of this small victory. Sleep well, son. As he turned to go, Ethan called after him. Dad? Yes, Marcus is pretty cool, isn't he? Richard nodded, his smile deepening. Yes, he is. We got lucky with him. Yeah, Ethan agreed. We did. It wasn't much, a brief exchange, a tentative plan, but as Richard walked to his own room, it felt like the first step on a new path. One where they might find their way back to each other, not as they were before, but as they could be now. The next month brought steady progress. Ethan's grades improved dramatically, and he began to show interest in things beyond academics. He joined an online photography forum, started sketching designs for camera equipment adaptations, and even reconnected with an old friend who came to visit one Saturday afternoon. Richard made a conscious effort to engage with Ethan on his terms, not pushing for the old Ethan to return, but getting to know the person his son was becoming. They established a Sunday routine of setting up photography shoots around the property, with Richard once again serving as Ethan's assistant, this time with greater patience and appreciation for his son's artistic vision. Marcus became a fixture in their lives, sometimes staying for dinner, occasionally joining them for movie nights when Ethan insisted. Richard found himself looking forward to these evenings, enjoying the easy camaraderie that had developed between the three of them. But underneath this new normal, tensions were brewing that none of them had anticipated. The first hint of trouble came in the form of a phone call from Richard's sister, Catherine. She and her husband lived in Boston and had been regular visitors before the accident. Since then, their appearances had become less frequent, their discomfort with Ethan's condition painfully apparent despite their efforts to hide it. We'd like to come for a visit next weekend, Catherine said, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. James has a conference in Hartford, and we thought we'd extend the trip to see you and Ethan. That would be wonderful, Richard said, genuinely pleased. Ethan's doing much better these days. I think you'll be surprised by the changes. Oh, has there been some improvement with his condition? The hope in her voice made Richard wince. His condition is the same, Catherine. He's paralyzed from the waist down. That hasn't changed and won't change, but his outlook, his engagement with life, that's what's different. Oh, she couldn't quite hide her disappointment. Well, that's good too, of course, Richard sighed inwardly. He has an excellent tutor now. Marcus has made a real difference. Marcus, that's the tutor from the agency? Yes, he's been with us for about 2 months now. He connects with Ethan in a way the others didn't. There was something in her tone that made Richard's guard go up. And what's his background? He's a PhD candidate at MIT, mathematics, former high school teacher with special education experience. I see. A pause. And he works with Ethan every day? Most days, yes. Why do you ask? No reason, just curious. Her voice shifted to a more upbeat register. Anyway, we'll plan on arriving Friday evening if that works. Richard agreed to the plans, but after hanging up, he felt a nagging unease. There had been something in Catherine's questioning that felt off. A subtext he couldn't quite decipher, but that left him vaguely defensive. He dismissed the feeling and focused on preparing for their visit. Catherine and James had always been critical of his parenting choices, even before the accident. Too lenient, too indulgent, not structured enough. Their own children, now in college, had been raised with strict schedules and expectations. Richard had never adopted their approach, believing that Ethan's natural curiosity and intelligence flourished with guidance rather than control. The weekend arrived, and with it, Catherine and James. They greeted Ethan with the same awkward combination of exaggerated cheer and careful avoidance of any mention of his wheelchair that characterized all their post-accident interactions. But Ethan, to Richard's relief, seemed unbothered, responding with a level of social grace that had been absent for the past 2 years. At dinner that evening, the conversation flowed more easily than Richard had expected. Ethan talked about his recent photography projects, his improved grades, and his growing interest in adaptive technology design. Catherine and James exchanged surprised glances as their nephew engaged them directly, asking about their lives and work with genuine interest. "This is quite a transformation," James commented, looking from Ethan to Richard. "You mentioned a new tutor." "Marcus," Ethan answered before his father could. "He's awesome. He's helping me apply to this summer program at MIT for high school students interested in engineering. It's all virtual, so I can do it from here." "That sounds wonderful," Catherine said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "And this Marcus, he's qualified for that kind of guidance. College applications can be quite complex." "He's literally studying at MIT right now," Ethan replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "He knows the system from the inside." "Of course," Catherine backpedaled slightly. "I just meant Marcus is exceptionally qualified," Richard interjected smoothly. "His recommendations were impeccable and his results speak for themselves." He gestured toward Ethan. "You can see the difference." "Indeed," James nodded. "Very impressive." The conversation moved on, but Richard noticed a tension that hadn't been there before. After dinner, when Ethan had gone to his room to work on a project, Catherine cornered Richard in the kitchen while he was making coffee. "Richard, don't take this the wrong way," she began, lowering her voice, "but are you sure about this tutor? What do you mean?" "Well, it's just." She glanced toward the doorway, ensuring they were alone. "You don't really know anything about him, do you, beyond what's on paper?" Richard felt a flare of irritation. "I know he's transformed my son from an angry, withdrawn teenager into someone who's engaged with life again. That's what matters." "Of course that matters," Catherine agreed quickly. "But so does safety. Having a stranger in your home every day, spending hours alone with Ethan." "Marcus is hardly a stranger at this point," Richard interrupted. "He's been with us for months." "Still," Catherine pursed her lips. "Have you run a background check?" "Beyond what the agency provided." "What exactly are you suggesting, Catherine?" Richard's voice had an edge now. She sighed, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm just concerned. You're a wealthy man, Richard, and you live out here isolated. For God's sake." Richard pulled away from her touch. "You think Marcus is what, casing the place, planning a robbery?" No, she said quickly. "But you have to admit it's unusual. His type doesn't typically." "His type." Richard cut her off, his voice dangerously quiet. "What exactly do you mean by his type, Catherine?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I just meant someone so young with his background, working as a tutor when he could probably make more money elsewhere." But Richard wasn't fooled. The implication had been clear, and it disgusted him. "Marcus is here because he's an exceptional educator who connects with my son. That's all that matters to me." "I'm just trying to look out for you," Catherine insisted. "After everything with Anna and then the accident, you've been through so much. I don't want to see you or Ethan hurt again." The sincerity in her voice took some of the wind out of Richard's sails. She was wrong deeply, troublingly wrong, but her concern came from a place of love, however misguided. "I appreciate that," he said more gently. "But you need to trust my judgment on this. Marcus has been nothing but professional, dedicated, and genuinely invested in Ethan's progress." The conversation ended there, but it left Richard unsettled. He'd never considered himself prejudiced. He'd built a diverse company, donated to civil rights causes, raised Ethan to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. But Catherine's insinuations had forced him to confront an uncomfortable question. Would he have had the same instinctive defense of Marcus if he'd been white? He wanted to believe he would have, that his reaction was based solely on Marcus's positive influence on Ethan. But doubt nagged at him. Had there been a moment, however brief, when he'd hesitated to hire Marcus because of his race? Had he monitored the early tutoring sessions more closely than he would have otherwise? The questions followed him through the remainder of the weekend, coloring his interactions with his sister and brother-in-law. By the time they left on Sunday afternoon, Richard was relieved to see them go, a sentiment Ethan clearly shared. "Aunt Catherine's turned into a real piece of work, hasn't she?" Ethan commented as they watched the car disappear down the driveway. Richard gave his son a sideways glance. "You picked up on that, did you? Kind of hard to miss." Ethan shrugged. "The way she kept asking about Marcus like he was some kind of criminal just because he's black." The bluntness of the statement startled Richard. "You think that's what it was about?" Ethan gave him an incredulous look. "What else? She didn't care about the other tutors and they were all alone with me too." Richard couldn't argue with that logic. "I'm sorry you had to hear that kind of prejudice from family." "I'm used to it," Ethan said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Uncle James made a comment last Christmas about those people when there was a news story about protests in Chicago, and Grandpa Blackwood is even worse." Richard stared at his son, shocked both by the observation and the casual way Ethan delivered it. Had he been so oblivious to the prejudice in his own family, or had he simply chosen not to see it to maintain peace to avoid uncomfortable confrontations? "You shouldn't have to be used to it," Richard said finally, "and I shouldn't have let it pass unchallenged." Ethan looked at him curiously. "Would you have said something before, before Marcus?" The question hit with unexpected force. "I'd like to think so," Richard said honestly, "but I'm not sure. Sometimes it's easier to ignore the problem than confront it." "Yeah," Ethan agreed, a note of sadness in his voice. "I get that." They fell silent, both lost in thought as they turned back toward the house. Richard found himself wondering what other difficult truths his son had observed that he'd been blind to, and he wondered how many more uncomfortable revelations awaited him on this journey they'd begun. The following Wednesday, Marcus arrived for the tutoring session looking troubled. Richard, who happened to be in the front hall when he entered, immediately noticed the change in his normally composed demeanor. "Everything all right?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. "Fine, just a little distracted, nothing to worry about." But the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. "Ethan's in the library setting up for your session," Richard said. "But if you need a minute." Marcus glanced toward the library, then back at Richard. "Actually, if you have a moment, there is something I should mention." Richard led him to the small sitting room off the main hall, closing the door for privacy. "What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I'm not sure if it's relevant, but I was followed yesterday on my way home." "Followed by whom?" "A black SUV, tinted windows. It stayed behind me from here all the way to my apartment in Cambridge." Richard frowned. "Could be a coincidence." "That's what I thought," Marcus agreed. "But the same vehicle was parked across from my building this morning. When I left for class, it pulled out behind me." "Did you get a license plate?" "Partial. Massachusetts plates started with PTX." Richard's frown deepened. A suspicion was forming, but he didn't want to voice it without evidence. "I debated whether to mention it," Marcus continued. "I don't want to create problems where there aren't any, but given your position, I thought you should know." The implication was clear. Wealthy families sometimes attracted unwanted attention from the press, from criminals, from the merely curious. "I appreciate you telling me," Richard said. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, if you notice anything else unusual, let me know immediately." Marcus nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank you, and I apologize if I'm overreacting." "Better safe than sorry," Richard assured him. "Now I believe my son is waiting for you." After Marcus left for the library, Richard remained in the sitting room, turning over the information in his mind. A black SUV with Massachusetts plates beginning with PTX. His brother-in-law James drove a black Cadillac Escalade. Richard had commented on it just last weekend when they'd arrived. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Catherine's pointed questions about Marcus, followed immediately by someone tailing him. Richard felt a cold anger building in his chest. If his suspicions were correct, his sister and brother-in-law had crossed a line. He picked up his phone and dialed Catherine's number. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright with false cheer. "Richard, what a lovely surprise. We were just saying what a wonderful visit we had." "Cut the act, Catherine," Richard interrupted. "Is James having Marcus followed?" There was a telling pause before she responded, her voice notably cooler. I don't know what you're talking about. A black SUV, Massachusetts plates starting with PTX, following Marcus from here to Cambridge and back. Ring any bells? Another pause, longer this time. Richard, you have to understand. So it is James. Jesus Christ, Catherine, what the hell were you thinking? We were thinking about your safety, she snapped, dropping the pretense. About Ethan's safety. You've let a complete stranger into your home, someone with access to everything. Marcus is not a stranger, Richard cut her off. He's a trusted employee and, frankly, someone I consider a friend at this point. You've known him for, what, 2 months? That's hardly long enough to know he's not a threat, Richard finished for her. This stops now, Catherine. Today, call James and tell him to back off, or I will. Richard, please. Her voice softened, taking on the reasonable tone she'd used since they were children to get her way. We hired a professional service. They're just doing a thorough background check, verifying his credentials, making sure everything's above board. Without my knowledge or consent, that's not concern, Catherine. That's invasive and inappropriate. Richard struggled to keep his voice level. And let's be honest, you wouldn't be doing this if Marcus were white. That is not fair, she protested. This has nothing to do with race. Doesn't it? You didn't investigate any of the previous tutors. What's different about Marcus? Her silence was damning. Call it off, Richard said firmly. Now, or our relationship will suffer for it. You're overreacting, Catherine said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. We're just looking out for you. No, you're indulging your prejudice under the guise of concern. I'm not blind to what's happening here. Richard heard her intake of breath, the beginning of another protest, but he'd had enough. I have to go. Call James. End this today. He hung up without waiting for her response. For several minutes, he sat with the phone in his hand, processing the conversation. The realization that his own sister could behave this way, could subject Marcus to surveillance based on nothing but racial bias, was deeply disturbing. Even more troubling was the knowledge that, not long ago, he might have dismissed her concerns as simple overprotectiveness rather than seeing the prejudice at their core. He thought about telling Marcus the truth, but decided against it for now. No need to add the burden of family drama to what Marcus was already dealing with. Instead, he'd ensure the surveillance stopped and then determine the best path forward. With a heavy sigh, Richard rose and headed toward his office. The conversation with Catherine had shaken him, forcing him to confront not just her prejudice, but the environment of privilege that had allowed him to remain oblivious to such attitudes for so long. It was an uncomfortable awakening, but perhaps a necessary one. As he passed the library, he heard Ethan laughing again, a sound that had once been rare but was becoming wonderfully common. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Richard was certain of one thing. Marcus Wright had changed their lives for the better, and he wouldn't allow anyone, family included, to interfere with that. The surveillance stopped, but the incident left Richard increasingly aware of the undercurrents of prejudice that had always existed around him, but that he'd had the privilege to ignore. He found himself paying closer attention to comments from business associates, neighbors, even longtime friends, noticing the subtle assumptions, the coded language, the casual biases that peppered everyday conversation. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing an aspect of the world he'd been able to overlook from his position of wealth and whiteness. The revelation was uncomfortable, forcing him to examine his own complicity in systems he'd never fully acknowledged. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to flourish under Marcus's guidance. His grades had improved so dramatically that his teachers had contacted Richard to express their amazement at the transformation. More importantly, Ethan was engaging with life again, making plans, setting goals, looking toward a future that had seemed unimaginable just a few months earlier. The relationship between father and son was healing too, slowly but steadily. It established new rituals: Sunday photography sessions, Friday movie nights, occasional drives to the coast where Ethan could photograph the ocean. They were learning to communicate in ways that honored who Ethan was now, not who he had been before the accident. And Marcus had become more than a tutor. He was a trusted presence in their home, someone both Richard and Ethan looked forward to seeing. The three of them had fallen into a comfortable dynamic, each bringing something essential to the balance they'd created. But Richard knew that balance was temporary. Marcus would eventually complete his PhD and move on to the next phase of his career. Ethan would graduate high school and hopefully attend college. Their lives would inevitably diverge. The thought troubled Richard more than he wanted to admit, not just for Ethan's sake, but for his own. These thoughts were weighing on him one evening in late May as he worked in his home office. The house was quiet, Ethan already in bed after a long day that had included a challenging physical therapy session. Richard was reviewing quarterly reports when a knock on his office door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, expecting Mrs. Winters with a question about the household schedule. Instead, Marcus opened the door, still dressed in the button-down and slacks he'd worn for tutoring earlier. "Sorry to disturb you. I left some papers I need for tomorrow." Mrs. Winters let me in. "No problem," Richard said, setting aside his work. "Can I help you find them?" "No need. I know they're in the library. I just didn't want to startle you if you heard someone moving around." Richard nodded, then, making a spontaneous decision, added, "Would you like a drink before you go? I could use a break from these reports." Marcus hesitated only briefly. "Sure, that would be nice, thank you." Richard poured them each a bourbon, and they settled into the comfortable leather chairs by the fireplace. Though it was late May, the evening still carried a chill that made the small fire welcome. "How's Ethan doing after PT today?" Richard asked. "He seemed tired at dinner." "Pushing himself hard," Marcus replied. "The therapist mentioned he's showing more upper body strength, which is good, but he's frustrated with the pace." Richard nodded, familiar with his son's impatience. "He's always been that way, wanting results immediately. Even as a small child, he couldn't bear the process of learning something new. He just wanted to be good at it already." Marcus smiled. "That tracks with what I've seen, but he's learning patience bit by bit." "Thanks to you," Richard acknowledged, raising his glass slightly. "He does the work," Marcus demurred. "I just provide the structure." They fell into a comfortable silence, sipping their drinks and watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Richard found himself studying Marcus covertly, the thoughtful set of his features, the quiet confidence in his posture, the intelligence in his eyes. In the months since he'd entered their lives, Marcus had revealed himself to be not just an exceptional teacher, but a person of remarkable depth and character. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said suddenly. Marcus looked up from his drink. "Of course. Why did you become a tutor?" "With your qualifications, you could be doing many things, most of them more lucrative." Marcus considered the question, taking another sip of bourbon before answering. "After my brother died, school became my refuge. I had this one teacher, Mr. Harrington, AP Physics, who saw past the tragedy, past the label of victim everyone else had given me. He pushed me academically, but also gave me space to process what had happened." He rotated the glass in his hands, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. "I decided then that I wanted to do that for someone else someday." "You've certainly done that for Ethan," Richard said quietly. "It goes both ways," Marcus replied. "Working with him has reminded me why I love teaching. The academic track can make you forget sometimes all the papers and conferences and theoretical frameworks. Ethan brings it back to what matters, helping someone discover their own potential." Richard nodded, understanding. "And after you finish your PhD, what then?" "I've been offered a research position at MIT, Marcus said, "but I'm also considering a private school in Boston that focuses on students with physical disabilities. The pay is less, but the work would be more meaningful." "You'd be exceptional at either," Richard said sincerely. "Thank you." Marcus finished his drink and set the glass aside. "I should get those papers and let you get back to work." But Richard wasn't ready for the conversation to end. "I never properly thanked you," he said. Marcus looked at him questioningly. "For Ethan," Richard clarified, "for bringing him back to life, for helping me see him clearly." "You don't need to thank me for that," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "It's been a privilege to work with him and with you." "Still," Richard leaned forward slightly, "I want you to know that whatever you decide to do after your PhD, I'd like to help. Whether it's funding research or setting up a scholarship program at that school, whatever would support your goals." Marcus looked surprised. "That's incredibly generous, but not necessary." "It's not charity," Richard said quickly. "It's an investment in someone who's already given my family more than I could ever repay." A complicated expression crossed Marcus's face, gratitude mixed with something like discomfort. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully. "But I need to make these decisions based on what's right for my career, not financial considerations." Richard realized immediately that he'd misstepped, that his offer, however well-intentioned, had created an imbalance in what had been an equal exchange. "Of course," he said, "I didn't mean to presume." "You didn't," Marcus assured him, "and I'm grateful for the thought behind it, but you need to find your own way," Richard finished for him, echoing what Marcus had once said about Ethan. Marcus smiled, the tension dissolving. "Exactly." After Marcus had retrieved his papers and left, Richard remained by the fireplace, turning over their conversation in his mind. He'd approached the situation like a business problem to solve, offering money as a solution when what Marcus valued was autonomy and purpose. It was a sobering reminder that despite his growing awareness, he still had blind spots, still defaulted to the privileges of wealth and position when navigating relationships. He resolved to be more mindful going forward, to remember that his role in Marcus's life was not that of benefactor or patron, but simply friend. It was an unfamiliar territory for a man accustomed to the power dynamics of corporate leadership, but one he was increasingly determined to navigate successfully. June brought with it a series of milestones. Ethan received his final grades for the year, a remarkable turnaround from the near-failing marks of the previous semester. He was accepted into the virtual summer program at MIT, a significant achievement that validated the hard work he'd put in. And perhaps most significantly, he agreed to attend his friend Jason's end-of-year party, his first social event since the accident. Richard watched these developments with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He was thrilled by Ethan's progress, but worried about the inevitable setbacks that would come with re-engaging with the world. The party, in particular, filled him with concern. How would Ethan's former friends respond to him now? Would the physical environment be accessible? Would Ethan retreat into anger if things didn't go smoothly? The day of the party, Richard found himself hovering more than usual, checking multiple times that Ethan had everything he needed, offering to drive him instead of letting him take the accessible van they'd purchased months ago but rarely used. "Dad, I've got this," Ethan said finally, exasperation clear in his voice. "Marcus is going to drive me. We already worked it out." Richard tried not to show his surprise. "Marcus is taking you?" "Yeah, he offered when I mentioned the party last week. Said he'd drop me off and pick me up, no big deal." Ethan gave his father a knowing look. "So you don't have to worry about it." "I wasn't worried," Richard protested automatically. Ethan rolled his eyes. "Right. That's why you've asked me 4 times if I have my phone charged." Richard had the grace to look sheepish. "Sorry, old habits." "It's fine," Ethan said, his expression softening. "But seriously, I'll be okay. Jason's parents renovated their ground floor last year. Everything's accessible, and if things get weird, I'll call Marcus to pick me up early." "Okay," Richard conceded. "Just have fun. You deserve it." When Marcus arrived later that afternoon, Richard thanked him for offering to drive Ethan. "It's no problem," Marcus assured him. "I remember how important these social milestones were at his age, and this way he doesn't have to arrive with his dad." Richard chuckled. "God forbid." He watched them leave, Ethan handling the transfer from his wheelchair to the car seat with practiced ease, Marcus folding the chair and stowing it in the trunk. The sight filled him with a complex emotion: gratitude for Marcus's intuitive understanding of what Ethan needed, sadness for the ongoing challenges his son faced, pride in the resilience both of them demonstrated daily. The house felt oddly empty with Ethan gone. Richard tried to focus on work but found himself distracted, wondering how the party was going, whether Ethan was being included or sitting on the sidelines. After an hour of accomplishing nothing, he decided to channel his nervous energy into something productive. He went to the kitchen and began assembling ingredients for Ethan's favorite meal, lasagna with garlic bread, a recipe Anna had perfected years ago and that Richard had struggled to replicate since her death. Tonight, he was determined to get it right. As he worked, layering noodles and sauce, mixing cheeses and herbs, Richard reflected on the journey of the past few months. The change in Ethan was remarkable, from a withdrawn, angry teenager to a young man cautiously re-engaging with life. And the change in himself was perhaps equally significant, though less visible from the outside. He had been forced to confront biases he hadn't acknowledged, to recognize privileges he'd taken for granted, to see his son not through the lens of what had been lost, but through the reality of who he was becoming. It had been uncomfortable, even painful at times, but necessary for both of them to move forward. Richard was so absorbed in these thoughts that he didn't hear the front door open, didn't realize anyone had entered the house until Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression grave. "What happened?" Richard asked immediately, alarm rising. "Is Ethan all right?" "He's fine physically," Marcus said, coming fully into the kitchen. "But there was an incident at the party. I brought him home." "What kind of incident?" Marcus hesitated. "I think Ethan should tell you himself. He's in his room. He asked for some time alone, but I think he could use your company right now, even if he doesn't realize it." Richard set down the spatula he'd been using, wiped his hands on a towel, and headed for the stairs, his mind racing with possibilities. At Ethan's door, he knocked gently. "Ethan, it's Dad. Can I come in?" There was a long pause before Ethan's voice, smaller than usual, responded, "Yeah." Richard entered to find his son by the window, his wheelchair angled so he could see the sunset over the trees. Ethan didn't turn when Richard came in, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Marcus said something happened at the party," Richard began, keeping his tone neutral. "Want to talk about it?" Ethan was silent for so long that Richard thought he might not answer. Then, still not turning, he said, "They were different, or maybe I'm different, I don't know." Richard moved to sit on the edge of Ethan's bed, giving him space but staying close. "Different how? Like they didn't know how to act around me." Ethan's hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. "Jason was okay at first, but then everyone got weird, talking around me instead of to me, moving things out of my way like I couldn't do it myself, asking if I needed help every 5 minutes." Richard nodded, recognizing the behaviors. He'd seen similar reactions from adults who didn't know how to interact with someone in a wheelchair, the awkward overcorrection, the performative helpfulness. "And then this girl, Maddie, she used to be my lab partner in chemistry. She asked me to dance." Ethan's voice caught slightly. "As a joke, I guess. Her friends were giggling. She kept saying, 'Come on, just one dance for old time's sake.' Like she'd forgotten I can't. That my legs don't." Richard felt a surge of anger on his son's behalf, but he kept his voice level. "That was cruel. The worst part is I think she meant to be nice," Ethan said, finally turning to face his father. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "She wasn't trying to be mean, she just didn't think, and that somehow makes it worse." "Thoughtlessness can hurt more than deliberate cruelty sometimes," Richard agreed. "I'm sorry that happened, Ethan." "I didn't know what to do," Ethan continued. Everyone was staring. "I felt like a freak show, so I texted Marcus to come early and I just left." "You did the right thing," Richard assured him. "Removing yourself from a situation that feels wrong is sometimes the strongest choice you can make." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I thought I was ready, to be normal again, but maybe that's not possible anymore." "Normal is overrated," Richard said, earning a skeptical look from his son. "I'm serious. What's normal anyway?" "A arbitrary standard set by people who have never had to overcome what you have." "Easy for you to say," Ethan muttered. "You fit in everywhere." Richard considered this. When I started my company, I was the youngest person in every room by at least a decade. No one took me seriously. They saw a kid playing at business, not someone with legitimate ideas." "It's not the same as what you're experiencing, not even close, but I do know what it's like to be dismissed based on something you can't change." Ethan looked thoughtful. "What did you do about it?" "I stopped trying to make them comfortable with who I was," Richard said. "I focused on the work, on proving my value through actions rather than words. Eventually, they had to acknowledge me on my terms, not theirs." "But I can't just ignore what happened tonight," Ethan protested. "I still have to deal with these people." "No, you can't ignore it," Richard agreed. "But you can choose how much power to give it. Tonight was one party with one group of people who didn't know how to handle their discomfort. That doesn't define what all social interactions will be like for you going forward." Ethan didn't look entirely convinced, but some of the tension had left his shoulders. "I guess. For what it's worth," Richard added, "I'm proud of you for going tonight. It took courage to put yourself out there." "Fat lot of good it did," Ethan said, but there was less bitterness in his voice. "You tried, that matters." Richard hesitated, then asked, "Is there anything I can do to help?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Actually, yeah, would it be okay if we invited Marcus to stay for dinner? He was really cool about everything, and I kind of left him hanging when we got home." "Of course," Richard said, surprised but pleased by the request. "I'm making lasagna. There's plenty." "Thanks, Dad." Ethan's mouth quirked in a small smile. "And fair warning, it's not Mom's lasagna unless you remember the secret ingredient. Extra oregano in the ricotta layer," Richard said with a smile of his own. "I remember." When he returned to the kitchen, Richard found Marcus still there, sitting at the island counter, his expression pensive. "How is he?" Marcus asked immediately. "Shaken, but handling it," Richard replied. "He told me what happened." "Thank you for being there for him." Marcus nodded. "I'm glad I could help." "Ethan asked if you'd stay for dinner," Richard said, returning to his lasagna preparation. "We'd both like that if you're free." "I'd be happy to," Marcus said, rolling up his sleeves. "Can I help with anything?" Richard handed him a cutting board and a loaf of French bread. "Garlic bread duty. Butter, garlic, and parsley are in the fridge." They worked side by side, falling into an easy rhythm. Richard found himself relaxing for the first time since Ethan had left for the party. There was something reassuring about Marcus's presence, a steadiness that both he and Ethan had come to rely on. "He'll be okay, Marcus said after a while, as if reading Richard's thoughts. "Tonight was hard, but it's part of the process. He's learning to navigate a world that wasn't built for him." "I know," Richard sighed. "I just wish I could make it easier for him." "You are," Marcus assured him. "By giving him space to find his own way, by not rushing in to fix everything, by letting him feel what he feels without trying to talk him out of it." He smiled slightly. "That's what good parents do. They walk beside their children through the hard parts, not try to carry them over them." Richard felt a warmth spread through his chest at the words. "Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I feel like I'm just stumbling through this, making it up as I go. Aren't we all? Marcus said with a quiet laugh. Life doesn't come with an instruction manual, especially the hard parts. They continued preparing the meal, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Marcus's recent academic presentation, Richard's new project at work, a book they'd both recently read. By the time Ethan joined them, wheeling himself into the kitchen with more energy than he'd had earlier, the atmosphere had lightened considerably. The three of them ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, the space filled with the aroma of garlic and tomato sauce, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Ethan recounted some of the more ridiculous moments from the party, finding humor now where there had been only hurt before. Marcus shared stories from his own awkward teenage years, making both Ethan and Richard laugh with his self-deprecating humor. It was, Richard realized with a start, the most normal family dinner they'd had in years, comfortable, joyful, connected. The irony wasn't lost on him that it had taken a near stranger entering their lives to help them find their way back to this simple pleasure. As the evening wound down and Marcus prepared to leave, Richard found himself wishing he could stay longer, that the warm cocoon they'd created could extend indefinitely. But he knew that wasn't realistic. Marcus had his own life, his own obligations beyond the Blackwood household. At the door, Richard thanked him again for everything he'd done that day. "It's nothing you wouldn't have done," Marcus replied. "Ethan's a remarkable young man. It's a privilege to be part of his journey." "Our journey," Richard corrected gently. "You've become important to both of us, Marcus. I hope you know that." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion Richard couldn't quite name. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a great deal to me." After Marcus left, Richard found Ethan in the library working on his laptop. "Homework?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Nah," Ethan replied without looking up. "Just some ideas for adaptations to my camera setup. I want to be able to adjust the tripod height without needing help." "Sounds interesting," Richard said. "Need any engineering input?" "Maybe later," Ethan said, still in the concept phase. Richard nodded, about to leave when Ethan spoke again. "Hey, Dad, yes. Thanks for tonight, for not making a big deal out of what happened, and for inviting Marcus to stay." "You're welcome," Richard said. "It was nice, wasn't it, the three of us?" Ethan looked up then, a knowing expression on his face. "Yeah, it was almost like." "Like what?" Richard prompted when Ethan didn't finish. "Like a family," Ethan said, watching his father's reaction carefully. "Is that weird to say?" Richard considered the question, the unexpected insight catching him off guard. "No," he said finally. "It's not weird at all." Ethan nodded, turning back to his laptop. "Good, because I like having him around. He gets me in a way most people don't, even you sometimes." "I know," Richard acknowledged. "And I'm grateful for that. We both needed him to enter our lives when he did." "Yeah," Ethan agreed softly. "We did." Richard left his son to his work, making his way upstairs with a curious lightness in his chest. The evening had begun with distress but had transformed into something unexpectedly healing, a reminder that family could be defined not just by blood but by understanding, by shared experiences, by the simple act of showing up when needed. For the first time since Anna's death, since Ethan's accident, the future felt not just bearable but full of possibility. They were finding their way forward, all of them together. The summer unfolded with a gentle rhythm. Ethan dove into his virtual MIT program with enthusiasm, his natural aptitude for mathematics and engineering flourishing under the structured curriculum. He spent hours in video conferences with professors and fellow students, engaging in discussions and collaborative projects that stretched his intellect in ways his regular schoolwork hadn't. Marcus continued to visit regularly, though his role had evolved from tutor to mentor and friend. He helped Ethan with the more challenging aspects of the MIT program, offered guidance on college applications, and provided a sounding board for Ethan's increasingly ambitious ideas about adaptive technology design. Richard, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads professionally. The company he'd built from nothing had grown beyond his wildest dreams, employing thousands and changing the technological landscape. But lately, he'd found his passion for the work waning, his mind increasingly occupied with thoughts of what would come next. One warm evening in late July, as Richard sat on the terrace watching the sunset, Marcus joined him, 2 glasses of iced tea in hand. "Ethan's on a conference call with his project team," Marcus explained, offering one of the glasses to Richard. "They're designing a prototype for a voice-activated camera system. He's in his element." Richard accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. "I haven't seen him this engaged with anything in years." He's found his purpose, Marcus said, settling into the chair beside Richard's, or at least a direction that excites him. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the sky transformed from blue to deep orange, streaks of pink and purple painting the horizon. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said finally, "Of course. Have you ever reached a point in your life where what once drove you no longer does, where you find yourself questioning choices you've never questioned before?" Marcus considered this. "You mean a midlife crisis?" he asked with a slight smile. Richard chuckled. "I suppose that's the cliché, isn't it? Middle-aged man suddenly questioning his life choices." "Clichés usually become clichés because they contain some truth," Marcus pointed out. "But to answer your question, yes, I've experienced something similar, though perhaps not on the same scale as what you're describing." "After Devon died," Richard guessed. Marcus nodded. "Everything I thought was important suddenly wasn't. My plans, my goals, they all seemed trivial in comparison to what had been lost." "How did you find your way forward?" "Slowly," Marcus said. "By letting go of who I thought I should be and paying attention to who I actually was becoming through the experience." He looked at Richard directly. "Are you thinking of making a change?" Richard sighed. "I've been considering stepping back from active leadership at Blackwood Tech, not retiring completely but shifting my focus, passing the CEO role to someone else." "That's a significant decision," Marcus observed. "What would you do instead? That's the question, isn't it?" Richard smiled ruefully. "I've been thinking about establishing a foundation focused on adaptive technology development and accessibility initiatives, using my resources and connections to support innovations that could help people like Ethan." "That sounds meaningful," Marcus said, "and it builds on your existing expertise while channeling it towards something personally significant." "It would mean a substantial lifestyle change," Richard acknowledged. "Less travel, more time at home, a different kind of challenge entirely." "And is that appealing or frightening?" Richard considered the question. "Both, I think. The business has been my identity for so long. But watching Ethan these past months, seeing how he's adapting and growing despite everything, it's made me reevaluate what really matters." "For what it's worth," Marcus said quietly, "I think you'd excel at leading such a foundation. You have the vision, the connections, and now the personal understanding of why it matters." "Thank you," Richard said, genuinely touched by the vote of confidence. "Your opinion means a great deal to me." The conversation shifted to other topics as the light faded from the sky, but Richard felt a sense of clarity that had been elusive before. The idea of the foundation, which had been forming in his mind for months, now felt like more than just a possibility. It felt like a path forward, a way to honor both Ethan's journey and his own evolving priorities. Later that night, after Marcus had gone and Ethan had retired to his room, Richard sat in his office, making notes about the potential structure and focus of the foundation. The more he fleshed out the concept, the more right it felt, a way to channel his business acumen and resources toward creating tangible change for people facing challenges similar to Ethan's. He was so absorbed in his planning that he almost missed the sound of Ethan's wheelchair approaching his office. The door was open and Ethan paused in the threshold, watching his father with curiosity. "Working late?" Ethan asked. Richard looked up, setting aside his notes. "Just some ideas I'm exploring. How was your call?" "Good," Ethan said, wheeling himself into the office. "We got the initial design approved, moving to prototype development next week." "That's fantastic," Richard said with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. You've accomplished so much this summer." Ethan shrugged, but Richard could see he was pleased by the praise. "It's interesting work, makes a difference, you know, designing things that could actually help people like me." "I do know," Richard said thoughtfully. "In fact, I've been thinking along similar lines myself." "Yeah," Ethan looked intrigued. "How so?" Richard hesitated, then decided to share his evolving plans. "I'm considering stepping back from day-to-day operations at Blackwood Tech, starting a foundation focused on adaptive technology and accessibility." Ethan's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Seriously, you'd leave the company?" "Not leave entirely," Richard clarified, "but shift my role, bring in new leadership for the operational side while I focus on this new venture." "Wow." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing this. "That's not what I expected. You love that company. You built it from nothing." "I did," Richard acknowledged, "and I'm proud of what we've accomplished. But priorities change, people change." He looked at his son directly. "You've taught me that, Ethan. Watching you adapt and grow these past months has been inspiring." Ethan looked embarrassed but pleased. "I don't know about inspiring. I'm just trying to figure things out." "Aren't we all?" Richard smiled. "So what do you think about the foundation idea?" "I think it's awesome," Ethan said without hesitation. "And I think you'd be great at it." You've always been better at the big vision stuff than the day-to-day management anyway. Richard laughed, surprised by his son's perceptiveness. That obvious, is it? Kinda, Ethan grinned. You get this glazed look during budget meetings. Mom used to tease you about it. The mention of Anna, offered so casually, caught Richard off guard. For so long, references to her had been painful, carefully avoided. But now Ethan had shared a memory without the cloud of grief that usually accompanied it. She did, Richard agreed softly. She always said I was a dreamer pretending to be a pragmatist. She was right, Ethan said. So maybe this foundation is you finally admitting it. Perhaps, Richard conceded. It's still just an idea, though, a lot of details to work out. Well, if you want input, Ethan said, I have some thoughts about what's actually needed. Most adaptive tech is designed by people who have never experienced disability firsthand. There's a disconnect. I'd value your perspective, Richard said sincerely. This would be as much your project as mine if you're interested. I'd like that, Ethan said, a spark of excitement in his eyes. Maybe it could even be something we work on together. Long-term, I mean, after college. The suggestion, so tentative, so hopeful, filled Richard with unexpected emotion. The idea that Ethan was thinking about their future together, about building something meaningful as father and son, was more than he had dared to hope for during the dark days following the accident. I'd like that very much, he said, his voice slightly rough with feeling. Ethan nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Anyway, I should get to bed. Early start tomorrow with the program. Good night, Ethan, Richard said. And thank you for your enthusiasm about this idea. It means a lot. After Ethan left, Richard returned to his notes with renewed purpose. What had begun as a personal exploration now felt like the beginning of a shared vision, a way for him and Ethan to forge a new relationship based not on what had been lost, but on what they could create together. It was, he reflected, another unexpected gift that had emerged from the challenges of the past years, a potential future he would never have envisioned, but that now seemed full of promise and possibility. August brought with it a sense of culmination. Ethan's MIT program was drawing to a close, with a virtual showcase of student projects scheduled for the final week. His team's adaptive camera system had been selected as one of the featured innovations, earning recognition from faculty and industry partners alike. Marcus, meanwhile, had received notification that his dissertation defense was scheduled for early September, the final hurdle before completing his PhD. He'd been spending more time at MIT preparing, his visits to the Blackwood house somewhat less frequent, but no less meaningful when they occurred. Richard had begun concrete steps toward his new venture, consulting with lawyers about the foundation's structure, reaching out to potential board members, and gradually transitioning responsibilities at Blackwood Tech to his COO, Sarah Chen, who would likely become his successor. The changes felt organic, a natural evolution rather than an abrupt shift. Richard found himself energized by the new direction, by the possibilities it presented for meaningful impact. And his relationship with Ethan continued to strengthen, their shared interest in the foundation creating a bridge between them that hadn't existed before. It was on a particularly beautiful Saturday afternoon that everything came to a head. Richard and Ethan had spent the morning photographing the late summer gardens, experimenting with a new remote trigger system Ethan had designed that allowed him greater independence in setting up and executing shots. They were reviewing the images on Ethan's laptop in the library when Marcus arrived, earlier than expected for their scheduled meeting about college applications. One look at his face told Richard something was wrong. Marcus, Richard set aside the camera he'd been holding. Everything all right? Marcus hesitated, glancing between father and son. I have some news, he said finally. I wanted to tell you both in person. Ethan closed his laptop, his expression wary. What kind of news? Marcus took a deep breath. I've been offered a position at Stanford, a tenure-track professorship in the mathematics department with a joint appointment in their accessibility technology initiative. The words hung in the air, their implications immediately clear. Stanford was across the country, nearly 3,000 miles from Connecticut. That's fantastic, Richard managed, forcing enthusiasm into his voice despite the sinking feeling in his chest. Congratulations, Marcus. Tremendous opportunity. When would you start? Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. January, Marcus replied. After I complete my PhD this fall, they're giving me time to relocate and settle in before the spring semester begins. So you'd be leaving. When? December. Ethan's fingers had tightened on the arms of his wheelchair, a tell Richard recognized as a sign of emotional stress. Likely mid-December, yes. Marcus moved further into the room, taking a seat across from them. I wanted to give you as much notice as possible to make arrangements for Ethan's continued tutoring if needed. I think we're beyond tutoring at this point, Richard said quietly, but we'll certainly miss your presence in our lives. Marcus nodded, looking troubled despite the positive news he'd shared. I've struggled with this decision, he admitted. The opportunity is exceptional. Stanford's program is at the forefront of mathematics research, and their accessibility initiative aligns perfectly with my interests. But what? Ethan prompted when Marcus didn't continue. But I've come to care deeply about both of you, Marcus said simply. Leaving feels difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated when I first took this position. The admission hung in the air, honest and unvarnished. Richard felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in Marcus's achievement, gratitude for his candor, and a profound sense of loss at the prospect of his departure. We've come to care about you too, Richard said, breaking the silence. You've become part of our family in many ways, but this opportunity sounds perfect for you, Marcus. We wouldn't want to stand in the way of that. Dad's right, Ethan added, though Richard could hear the effort it took for him to say it. Stanford's amazing. And California's probably a lot nicer than Boston in the winter. Marcus smiled faintly at that. True enough. When do you have to give them an answer? Richard asked. I already have, Marcus replied. I accepted the position yesterday. I wanted to be certain before I spoke with you both. Richard nodded, understanding the reasoning but feeling a pang nonetheless. The decision was made. Marcus would be leaving. It was the right choice for him professionally, without question, but that didn't lessen the impact it would have on the Blackwood household. We should celebrate, Richard said, making a decision. Your success deserves recognition. Let's have dinner tonight, something special. You don't have to do that, Marcus protested. We want to, Ethan said, surprising both men with his firmness. It's a big deal, Marcus. Let us be happy for you, even if we're sad for ourselves. The honesty of the statement brought a smile to Marcus's face. When you put it that way, how can I refuse? Thank you. The conversation shifted then to the practical aspects of Marcus's news. The timeline for his move, the details of the position, the logistics of finishing his PhD while preparing for the transition. Richard participated fully, asking appropriate questions and offering support where needed, but part of his mind was already racing ahead, contemplating what this change would mean for them. Marcus had become integral to their lives in ways that went far beyond his initial role as Ethan's tutor. He had helped them heal, individually and as a family. He had challenged their perspectives, broadened their understanding, and become a trusted friend and confidant. His absence would leave a void that Richard wasn't sure how to fill. Later, after Marcus had gone to prepare for dinner and Ethan had retreated to his room, Richard stood in his office, looking out at the gardens they'd photographed that morning. The beauty of the late summer blooms, the perfect light that had made their photography sessions so successful, it all seemed tinged with melancholy now. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear Ethan approach until his son spoke. It sucks, doesn't it? Richard turned to find Ethan in the doorway, his expression a mixture of resignation and sadness. Yes, Richard agreed simply, it does. I mean, I get it, Ethan continued, wheeling himself into the office. It's a huge opportunity for him. Stanford is like the dream for someone in his field, but still, we've grown accustomed to having him in our lives, Richard finished. It's natural to feel a sense of loss. He changed everything, Ethan said quietly, for both of us. I don't know where I'd be right now if he hadn't come along when he did. Neither do I, Richard admitted. He arrived exactly when we needed him most. They were quiet for a moment, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice hesitant. Dad, what if we asked him to stay? Richard looked at his son in surprise. What do you mean? What if we offered him a position with the foundation? Ethan suggested, the words coming faster now. He could help shape it from the ground up, use his expertise, his perspective. It would be a unique opportunity for him too, right? Richard considered this, turning the idea over in his mind. It would be, he acknowledged. But Stanford is offering him something we can't: academic prestige, research resources, a clear career path in his field. But we could offer him something meaningful too, Ethan persisted. Something he cares about. He's always talking about making a difference, about using technology to improve lives. That's exactly what the foundation would do. It's not that simple, Ethan, Richard said gently. Marcus has worked his entire adult life toward this type of academic position. Asking him to give that up, it's a lot to request of someone, no matter how much they care about us. Ethan's face fell. So we just let him go, without even trying to keep him here. I think we have to, Richard said, though the words cost him. If we truly care about Marcus, we need to support what's best for him, not just what we want. But what if staying is what's best for him too? Ethan challenged. What if he's only leaving because he doesn't realize he has other options? The question gave Richard pause. Was there truth to what Ethan was suggesting? Had they created an environment where Marcus felt his only path forward was to leave? Or was this simply wishful thinking on their part, a desire to keep someone they'd grown to love from moving on? I don't know, Richard said honestly, but I do know that whatever we decide, it has to come from a place of wanting what's best for Marcus, not just what's easiest for us. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this. So what do? We celebrate his success tonight, Richard decided. Genuinely, wholeheartedly, and then we think carefully about what, if anything, we want to offer as an alternative. It wasn't a satisfying answer, Richard knew, but it was the most honest one he could give in the moment, caught between his desire to keep Marcus in their lives and his recognition that doing so might not be what was truly best for the young man who had given them so much. Dinner that evening was a carefully orchestrated celebration. Richard had arranged for their favorite local restaurant to cater a meal that rivaled anything they might have had if they'd gone out. The dining room was set with the good china and crystal, candles adding a warm glow to the space. A bottle of champagne chilled in a silver bucket, a symbolic gesture to mark the significance of the occasion. Marcus arrived at 7, dressed more formally than usual in a charcoal suit with a deep blue tie. Seemed touched by the effort they'd made, though Richard detected an undercurrent of melancholy beneath his appreciation. This is too much, Marcus protested as Richard poured the champagne. Really, you didn't need to go to such trouble. It's not every day someone we care about achieves something this significant, Richard replied, handing him a flute. It deserves proper acknowledgement. They raised their glasses in a toast, to Marcus's success, to new beginnings, to the future that awaited him at Stanford. The conversation over dinner flowed naturally, touching on Marcus's plans for his courses, his research interests, the logistics of relocating to California. Ethan, to Richard's relief, participated fully, asking thoughtful questions and offering genuine congratulations despite the sadness Richard knew he felt. It was further evidence of his son's growth over the past months, his ability to set aside his own feelings to support someone he cared about. As they moved to the library for coffee and dessert after dinner, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The formality of the celebration gave way to something more intimate, more reflective. Seated before the fireplace, where a small fire had been lit to ward off the evening chill, they found themselves reminiscing about the months since Marcus had entered their lives. "Remember that first day?" Ethan said, a smile playing at his lips. "When you made that bet with me. That if you lasted 2 weeks, I'd have to give the tutoring a real chance," Marcus chuckled. "I was taking a calculated risk. I figured you wouldn't be able to drive me away as easily as the others." "Why not?" Richard asked, curious. "What made you so confident?" "I wasn't actually," Marcus admitted, "but I knew Ethan needed to feel some control over the situation. The bet gave him that while still moving us toward the goal." "It worked," Ethan acknowledged. "I was so determined to make you quit that I accidentally started engaging with the material." They all laughed at that, the memory softened by time and perspective. "You know," Marcus said after a moment, "when I took this position, I thought it would be temporary, a way to support myself through the final year of my PhD. I never expected." He paused, searching for the right words. "I never expected to find a connection like this, to become part of your lives in this way." "Neither did we," Richard said softly, "but I'm grateful for it, whatever the circumstances that brought you here." A comfortable silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Richard found himself studying Marcus's profile, illuminated by the golden light of the flames. There was a gravity to him tonight, a weight of decision that seemed to sit on his shoulders despite the celebration. "Marcus," Richard said suddenly, making a decision, "there's something I'd like to discuss with you." "Something Ethan and I have been considering." Marcus looked at him questioningly. "What is it?" Richard glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragement. "As you know, I'm in the process of establishing a foundation focused on adaptive technology and accessibility. It's still in the planning stages, but I'm committed to making it happen." "Yes, you've mentioned it," Marcus said. "It sounds like a worthwhile endeavor." "What I haven't mentioned," Richard continued, "is that I'm looking for someone to help lead the research division, someone with both the technical expertise and the personal understanding to guide our efforts effectively." Marcus's expression shifted as he began to grasp what Richard was suggesting. "Richard, before you say anything," Richard held up a hand, "I want to be clear. This isn't charity, and it isn't just because we want you to stay, though that's certainly true." This is a legitimate opportunity that aligns with your skills and interests. The position would come with competitive compensation, resources for research, and the chance to directly impact the development of technologies that could change lives. It would be amazing, Ethan added. You'd be in at the ground floor helping shape everything from the beginning. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the offer. I'm honored, he said finally. Truly, and in many ways it sounds ideal. But Stanford represents the culmination of your academic journey, Richard finished for him. A prestigious position that validates years of hard work, I understand that. It's not just the prestige, Marcus said carefully. It's the structure, the resources, the community of scholars, and yes, the validation proving that someone like me from where I come from can achieve that level of academic success. Richard nodded, understanding. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Just for you to consider it as an option, to know that there's a place for you here if you want it. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice sincere. That means more than I can express, regardless of what I decide. The conversation shifted then to the specifics of the foundation, Richard's vision for its structure and focus, the potential for collaboration with academic institutions like Stanford, the timeline for its official launch. It was a safer topic, less laden with emotional weight, and they all embraced it as a respite from the more difficult subject of Marcus's departure. Later, as the evening drew to a close and Marcus prepared to leave, Richard walked him to the door. Ethan had already said his goodbyes, heading to his room with a final hug for Marcus that had lasted longer than usual, betraying the depth of his feelings. At the door, Marcus turned to Richard, his expression serious. I want you to know something, he said. Regardless of what happens with Stanford or the foundation, what we've built here, this connection, this friendship, it doesn't end when I move. Distance changes relationships, but it doesn't have to destroy them. I know, Richard said, though the reassurance was welcome. And whatever you decide will support you. That's what family does. The word hung between them, unplanned but undeniably true. In the months since Marcus had entered their lives, he had become family in all the ways that mattered, through shared experiences, mutual respect, and genuine love. Thank you, Marcus said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd left unspoken. After he'd gone, Richard stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching the taillights of Marcus's car disappear down the driveway. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. Whatever Marcus decided, whatever path they all took from here, the connection they'd forged would remain, a testament to the healing that had occurred in this household over the past months. And for that, Richard was profoundly grateful. The weeks that followed were filled with a curious mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Marcus continued his visits, though less frequently as his dissertation defense approached. Ethan threw himself into preparations for the new school year, his outlook dramatically different from the previous fall. Richard divided his time between transitioning responsibilities at Blackwood Tech and laying the groundwork for the foundation. They didn't discuss the offer Richard had made that night after dinner. It hung between them, acknowledged but not directly addressed, as if they'd all tacitly agreed to let Marcus come to his decision without pressure. September arrived with crisp air and changing leaves. Marcus successfully defended his dissertation, officially earning his Ph.D., a milestone they celebrated with another special dinner at the Blackwood home. The pride Richard and Ethan felt was genuine, untainted by the knowledge that this achievement brought Marcus one step closer to his departure. It was a week after his defense, during a quiet Saturday afternoon, that Marcus finally broached the subject. The three of them were in the library, Ethan working on a college application essay, Richard reviewing documents for the foundation, and Marcus providing feedback on a research paper Ethan had written for his advanced placement physics class. I've been thinking about your offer, Marcus said suddenly, looking up from the paper. The position with the foundation. Richard set aside his documents, giving Marcus his full attention. Ethan, too, stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. And Richard prompted when Marcus didn't immediately continue. And I've decided to accept the position at Stanford, Marcus said gently. For now. The qualification caught Richard's attention. For now, Marcus nodded. The appointment is for 3 years initially. I've spoken with the department chair about the possibility of collaboration with your foundation, sharing research, potentially establishing a partnership between Stanford and Blackwood Adaptive Technologies. They're interested, especially given the resources you can bring to the table. So you'd be working with us just from California? Ethan clarified, hope threading through his voice. In a sense, yes, Marcus confirmed. And I'd like to propose regular visits quarterly, perhaps, to work directly with the foundation team here, Plus, technology makes distance less of an obstacle than it once was. Richard considered this, recognizing the thoughtfulness behind the solution Marcus was proposing. Wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was a compromise that honored both Marcus's academic ambitions and the connection they'd formed. "That sounds like a reasonable approach," Richard said carefully, "and the door remains open for a more permanent position with the foundation when your Stanford appointment ends, if you're interested at that point." "I appreciate that," Marcus said sincerely. "And I want you both to know that this decision wasn't easy. What we've built here, it matters to me a great deal." "We know," Ethan said, his voice steadier than Richard had expected. "And we want what's best for you, Marcus, really." The simple statement delivered with such maturity made Richard's chest tighten with pride. His son had grown so much in these months, not just academically but emotionally, developing a capacity for empathy and understanding that had been buried beneath anger and pain for too long. "Thank you," Marcus said, his own voice thick with emotion. "That means everything." The three of them fell silent, the moment heavy with feeling. Then Ethan, with typical teenage directness, broke the tension. "So does this mean you're still coming for Thanksgiving? Because Mrs. Winters already asked if you want dark meat or white meat turkey." Marcus laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I wouldn't miss it, and dark meat definitely." Just like that, the air cleared. They weren't losing Marcus. They were simply entering a new phase of their relationship. Distance would change things, but the foundation they'd built was strong enough to withstand it. The conversation shifted to practical matters. The timeline for Marcus's move, the structure of his collaboration with the foundation, plans for his visits back to Connecticut. Richard watched as his son and Marcus discussed these details, struck by how natural their interaction had become, how seamlessly they'd formed a bond that transcended their initial roles as tutor and student. Later that evening, after Marcus had left and Ethan had gone to bed, Richard sat in his office, reflecting on the journey they'd taken since that first day when Marcus had arrived at their door. The changes had been profound, in Ethan, in himself, in their relationship with each other. And all because he'd taken a chance on hiring someone different, someone whose background and experiences had initially made him hesitate, however briefly. The realization was humbling. How many other connections, how many opportunities for growth and healing had he missed throughout his life because of unconscious biases or unexamined assumptions? The thought was uncomfortable but necessary, part of the ongoing transformation that Marcus's presence had catalyzed. Richard opened his laptop and began drafting a mission statement for the Blackwood Foundation for Adaptive Technology. At its core would be a commitment not just to technological innovation, but to inclusivity, to bringing diverse perspectives to the table, to challenging the assumptions that limited both design and opportunity. It was, he reflected, a fitting legacy, not just for him and Ethan, but for the young man who had entered their lives at exactly the right moment and changed them forever. Whatever the future held, that impact would remain, rippling outward in ways none of them could fully predict, but that would undoubtedly create possibility where barriers had once stood. And in that knowledge, Richard found a deep and abiding peace. The days leading up to Marcus's departure for California were filled with a flurry of activity. There were logistics to coordinate for the Foundation's collaboration with Stanford, farewell gatherings with colleagues and friends, and the 1,000 details that accompany any major relocation. Through it all, the bond between Marcus, Richard, and Ethan remained strong. They'd settled into a new understanding, an acceptance that change was coming, but that it didn't diminish what they'd built together. If anything, the impending separation had deepened their appreciation for the connection they shared. The morning of Marcus's flight, Richard and Ethan drove him to the airport. The car was unusually quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts as the miles passed. It wasn't until they reached the terminal that the reality of the moment fully hit. "Well," Marcus said, looking at the bustling departure area, "I guess this is it." "Not it," Ethan corrected. "Just see you later. You'll be back for Thanksgiving, remember?" Marcus smiled. "You're right, not an ending, just a transition." They stood awkwardly for a moment, none of them quite sure how to navigate the goodbye. Then Ethan, with characteristic directness, wheeled himself forward and reached up for a hug. Marcus bent down, embracing him tightly. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "For everything." "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for teaching me as much as I taught you." When they separated, Ethan's eyes were suspiciously bright, but he managed a smile. "Call when you land, okay? Let us know you got there safely." "I will," Marcus promised. Then it was Richard's turn. He stepped forward, extending his hand first in a formal gesture that quickly transformed into an embrace as Marcus pulled him in. I don't have adequate words, Richard said quietly, for what you've meant to us, for what you've done for my son, for me. You don't need them, Marcus assured him. I know, and the feeling is mutual. They separated, both men blinking rapidly. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, offering it to Marcus. What's this? Marcus asked, taking it with a puzzled expression. Just a small token, Richard said. Something to remember us by. Marcus opened the box to reveal a platinum tie clip, elegant in its simplicity, with a small inscription on the back. Family transcends distance. R&E, Richard, Marcus began, his voice thick with emotion. You're part of our family now, Richard said simply. That doesn't change because you're in California. Marcus nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He carefully placed the tie clip back in its box and tucked it into his jacket pocket over his heart. I should go, he said finally. Security will take a while. Of course, Richard agreed. We'll wait until you're through. They watched as Marcus checked his bag, then turned back for one final wave before heading toward the security checkpoint. Even after he disappeared from view, they remained, neither quite ready to leave to make the departure real. He'll be back, Ethan said finally, as much to reassure himself as his father. Yes, Richard agreed. He will. The drive home was subdued, both lost in their thoughts. It wasn't until they were nearly back at the house that Ethan broke the silence. Dad, do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't hired Marcus, if you'd gone with one of the other tutors instead? Richard considered the question, its implications echoing beyond the immediate context. I try not to dwell on hypotheticals, he said carefully. But yes, I've thought about it, and I'm profoundly grateful that I made the choice I did, however hesitant I might have been initially. Ethan nodded. Me too, even with him leaving, even with how hard that is, I wouldn't trade the time we had with him for anything. Neither would I, Richard agreed softly. As they pulled up the long driveway to the house, Richard found himself reflecting on the journey they'd taken since that first day when Marcus had arrived for the interview. The changes had been profound. In Ethan, in himself, in their relationship with each other. What had begun as a simple employment arrangement had evolved into something far more significant, altering the course of all their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. And it had all started with a single decision, to look beyond his initial discomfort, to give someone a chance based on their qualifications rather than his preconceptions. It was a humbling realization, one that would continue to influence his choices moving forward, both personally and through the foundation they were building together. Inside the house, they settled into their routines, Ethan to his schoolwork, Richard to foundation planning. The absence of Marcus was palpable, a quiet space where his presence had been. But there was also a sense of continuity, of carrying forward what he had helped them build. That evening, as promised, Marcus called to let them know he'd arrived safely in California. They spoke briefly, the conversation light and practical, details about his apartment, the weather, his schedule for the coming days. What remained unspoken was the depth of feeling that connected them across the miles, the bond that had transformed them all. After hanging up, Richard found Ethan in the library, looking through photographs on his laptop, images from the summer, many featuring Marcus alongside them in various settings around the property and beyond. Good pictures, Richard commented, sitting beside his son. Yeah, Ethan agreed. I was thinking of putting together an album. Something to document everything that's happened since. Well, since things started to change. I think that's a wonderful idea, Richard said. A record of our journey. Our journey, Ethan repeated thoughtfully. I like that. It's not over, is it? Just entering a new phase. Exactly, Richard agreed, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Just a new chapter in a continuing story. Outside, the first leaves of autumn were beginning to fall, golden in the late afternoon light. Inside, father and son sat together, looking through images of the past while planning for a future neither had imagined possible just months before. It was, Richard reflected, the most precious gift Marcus had given them, not just healing from the past, but hope for what lay ahead. And in that gift there was both sadness and joy, loss and gain, ending and beginning, the complex tapestry of a life fully lived with all its challenges and all its blessings. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything,